going to speak about one of the most critical points in regards to our challenges, because our challenge today is about our financial area. In the last two challenges, we spoke about our labor area. And so little by little, we're giving structure to the 21 challenges in each one of the 7 areas. It's important that you begin putting everything together and giving it structure. We are beginning to prepare our 7 days of fasting, because I do not want us to be caught by surprise. We spoke about planning. We spoke about preparation in order to really make a complete change. And if we want to make a complete change this year, 2025, we have to begin with this. And I continue to insist, if there is someone who did not start the challenges from the beginning because perhaps they weren't prepared or motivated at the time, but now, as we've progressed, they're getting into it, they feel motivated. Or if someone has not yet began, you still have time. You can begin the challenges today and prepare for our fast that places everything on God's altar. And at the end of our fast, we're going to have a feast. We call this our Feast of First Fruits, where we turn over our first fruits to the Lord and commend our plans to the Lord for this year. As we pray, consecrating our life, our family, our plans, our children. This is our plan after these 21 days of challenge. Then we will carry out our 7 days of fasting and give God absolutely every opportunity to glorify Himself in our lives through this entire exercise that we're carrying out. Okay, challenge number 12. Please take a pen and paper, a notebook. Take notes. And I want to tell you, we're very happy because we know that many people are carrying out these challenges, entire families. And this brings joy to my heart. Okay, challenge number 12. Pay close attention. No one knows what they have until they write it down. Nobody knows what they have until they write it down. And what does this mean? This means living by a budget. How to create a budget and how to live radically adjusted to this budget. Look, in order to be able to see your money, to fulfill your plans, for your projects to become a reality, we must have discipline in this financial area. And believe me, when we organize things, it is magical. And there's something particular about this, because money attracts more money when it is organized well, when we are well organized in this area. This is why the Bible tells us, who has will be given more. And this is logical. Those who have and are good administrators, managers of their funds, they're able to produce even more. In turn, the same biblical logic tells us who does not have will, or the little they have will be taken. Because unfortunately, not only do we have little, but if we do not administrate it well, if we do not have financial discipline, we lose even the little that we have. I'm going to begin with 2 biblical texts, and I'd like you to read with me because they are fundamental to understand what we said at the beginning, that no one knows what they have until they write it down. Having and living by a budget. The first text that we will read is in 2 Kings chapter 4, and it says, "The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elijah, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves.' Elijah replied to her, 'How can I help you? Tell me what you have in your house.'" Pay close attention to this. A widow goes to the prophet Elijah and says to him, "Look, my husband left me an inheritance of debts that I cannot repay." And the problem at that time is that if you had debts that you could not repay, the creditors would come and they were able to enslave you or enslave someone in your family until you paid the last cent owed. And so this was the news that this widow received, not only that her husband had died, but that since she had 2 sons, the creditors were going to come and take her children and make them work until they repaid the last cent that her husband owed. And so faced with the situation, of course, the widow goes to the prophet and says, Elijah, I have a great problem. I just lost my husband and I am about to lose my children, my sons. And so now this widow and her sons are in a situation where they do not even have enough to eat. And what calls my attention here is that the first thing the prophet says is, what can I do? How am I able to help you in the situation you're in? But then he says to her, tell me, what do you have in your house? And so the miracle starts with what she presents. And as we will read in the story, in those days, fuel was comprised of oil, not gasoline like today, but instead oil. So who had oil had fuel for fire, for cooking in order to eat, and who had much oil was rich. And so it was very common to find in homes vessels or perhaps barrels with faucets to extract the oil inside. And so notice in this context of time, the prophet says to the woman, what do you have? And I want to touch on this important topic, this important point today, based on our topic, because she answers as most of us would answer when anyone talks about money. Because when Elijah asks her, what do you have in your house? She says, I have nothing, absolutely nothing at home. And it's often the same way with us. We work and we have a salary, but if someone asks us, what do you have? Many of us respond and say, I have nothing. And we receive money from one place, from another, but we take that money and we pay here and we pay there. So what do we have now? We have nothing. Even if we have something, our answer is we have nothing. I have nothing. And I do not know if this answer is emotional, cultural, but this negation that we have often has to do with our lack of financial intelligence and our scarce financial blessing that is noticeable. And so the prophet says to her, no, go, look, and find anything that you may have. And so the woman says, look, I have a vessel where typically I place oil, but that vessel is empty. But the prophet said, okay, I'll make it work. But not only that, go and find as many vessels as you can. And this is incredible. What happened was incredible. The widow went with her sons, and they brought back several vessels. And the prophet told them to remain at home. And then do the following. Open up the spout of each vessel. The widow must have said, why open the spout if there's nothing inside? But the prophet said, open the spout. And when she did, oil flowed out, and she began to fill the vessels and to fill more and more vessels. And the point came where the mother said to her sons, go and bring more vessels. To which they answered, there are no more. And when the vessels ran out, the oil ran out. Those who have heard me speak about this topic, this story before, know that I am fascinated by this story that leads me to the conclusion. And my conclusion is that the oil never ran out. What ran out were the vessels. And this is why the oil stopped flowing, because the oil represents God, and God never runs out. God is not limited. God does not sleep. God does not rest. God is not dead. God represents life, abundance, prosperity. From Him comes everything, health, joy, blessing, everything that you may need. What does run out are the vessels. God will always be limited to our lack of faith, our lack of trust. This is why there's a biblical text in Psalm 81:10 that says, open wide your mouth and I will fill it. I am who limits God. God has to work with our narrow minds and narrow hearts. We do not have more because we do not ask for more. We do not have more because we do not even know what we have. Where did this marvelous miracle begin? Did you know that when the prophet arrived, the widow, he said to the widow, now go and sell that oil, pay your debts, and the rest is for you and your family to live off. And so imagine the amount of oil that she was able to gather, enough to pay all the creditors and have enough left over to live. And so do you know what we're talking about here? Precisely the topic of our challenge, that no one knows what they have until they write it down. This woman began by saying she had nothing, But the prophet gives her a lesson. God will work with what you have, and if you continue to say you have nothing, you will be poor your entire life and die poor. But there is no reason for this because you have gifts, talents, capabilities. I can tell you stories and stories of businesses, of people who have started their business who, at the beginning, had nothing. But one day they realized, well, I'm able to do this. I have this talent. I know how to do this or that. In my family, we've always done this. And one day they gave it a name. They opened a store. They went to market. And many today are millionaires. And it all began with, I know how to do this. This is what my family does. I have a talent, a gift for this. Incredible. You cannot imagine the thousands of startups after pandemic, thousands of new businesses. And why? Because someone during the pandemic said, I'm not working right now, but I can do this. I know how to do this, and I can perhaps find a partnership with someone I know or ask for a loan to start my business. And tremendous things happened after that. So please, today, when we talk about a budget, do not begin with saying that you do not have anything, or that you earn very little, or that you live off with what others give you. No, the first thing we're going to do is to write down what we have, even if it's an empty vessel, like that of this woman. And the second story we're going to talk about is in John 6, that I'm sure you've heard before. Do you recall the story of the multiplying of bread and fish? There's something that calls my attention powerfully, because remember that Jesus begins to preach, and John 6 talks about when Jesus began his ministry. People were beginning to know who Jesus was, and so his fame began to spread everywhere. And the regions where Jesus preached at that time had small populations of people with small groups of homes. So they weren't huge towns or cities, but Jesus' fame, because of his miracles and his wisdom, grew to where people began to gather to come to him. Even from foreign lands, the Bible says that people would walk for days and weeks to come and see Jesus, to be healed or ask for a miracle. And so John 6 tells us a story where everyone coincided and gathered together for a great event. So Jesus began to preach and people began to arrive. And many had journeyed from far away. And so when Jesus began to preach, his sermon became long. And look at what it says in John 6, verse 5. It says, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And so imagine the crowd, the great number of people. And so not only did Jesus notice that there were many people, but he also took into consideration that they had traveled for days. And of course, remember that in those times, when you journeyed, you did not find a store every 10-15 minutes where you can buy snacks or a bag of chips. No, sir, there was barely enough food to eat in the homes, much less would you find food for sale. And so these people had traveled, but they had nothing. And Jesus noticed this. And this verse calls my attention so much because it says that when Jesus looked up and he saw the great crowd, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? But look at what it says in verse 6, tremendous. Jesus says to Philip, where shall we buy bread to feed all these people? But here John makes a parenthesis as he writes the story. He says that Jesus did this to test him because he knew what he was going to do. Ah, how beautiful. And I would venture to say that this describes us. And this reminds us of the story of the widow and Elijah, because Philip answered, it would take more than half a year's wage to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. In other words, even if we were to use up our entire budget, the 200 denarii that we carry with us to pay for our trips, our journeys, our own food, would it be enough to buy bread for each one to have a bite? Lord, send them home. But then we see a second disciple, Andrew, the brother of Simon, in verse 8. And in verse 9, he says, here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. And the Lord said, bring him. And so let's look at both stories we have discussed. The prophet worked with what the widow brought him, with an empty vessel. What did Jesus work with? Well, with the 5 pieces of bread and the 2 fish. And so my question to all of you is, what does God work with? He works with what you have, with what you present to him. So please, no longer say that you do not have anything, that you have nothing, that you are poor, that no one gives you anything, because you do have, and you have a lot. So the first thing we have to do is to determine and to present what we have. And so first, what is a budget? A budget precisely gives me the ability to say, this is what I have, and this is how I'm going to use it. How am I going to make my life functional with what I have? This is the purpose of a budget, and this is why everyone, before beginning a new month, or perhaps bi-weekly or weekly, they must have a budget. And why? Because if we have a home where to live, we have to pay either rent, mortgage, property taxes, utilities, but there is always something to pay. If I have a family, or even just for myself, I have to pay for food, for healthcare, tuition, and of course we have a social life that demands that we buy this or that. And so we dress, we spend, we go on vacation, we have a car or a vehicle to commute. But keep in mind that all these things represent more expenses. For example, there are those who say, I want to have a car, I want to have a car. And when they buy a car, they say, I had no idea that there were so many expenses in having a car. I can't afford this. I have to pay for gas. I have to pay for insurance. I have to pay for maintenance. I have to pay for parking. I have to pay for tolls. So those who never had a vehicle before say, well, I had no idea that all these expenses were involved. But yes, that's how it works, and that's how many things in life work. And so the things that we have, that we obtain, come with obligations. And this is why we have to have a good financial mindset, as well as financial intelligence. Because if we do not take care of our money, we're going to have grave problems, especially when it's so hard to earn it, to make it, and so easy to spend it. Okay, before beginning with our details of our budgets, which is our challenge today, as we talk about our topic that no one knows what they have unless they write it down. What does a budget reveal? To me, a budget reveals in the life of many that we live by miracles. Because there are those who say, how can I live with a minimum wage? And I pay for rent, I pay for food, I pay for this, for that. And sometimes I'm even able to go to a restaurant or to go on vacation. And somehow it's enough. And so what does the budgets of many reveal? Well, that your life is a miracle. Second, a budget reveals that often we have expenses that are out of our control. Until we spend money on many things that later we look at and we say, why did I spend my money on this? If I do not have this written down in my budget, why did I spend my money on that if it's not in my budget? And then we begin to see that we have a bunch of expenses that we're not considering. This is why we have to write everything down in our budget. Third, what does a budget reveal? A budget reveals that we're paying a lot of money in interest. There are those who use their credit cards without even realizing it, without realizing that the highest interest rates are tied to credit cards, that sometimes we're paying 3 or 4 times the price of a product because we're making monthly payments where the majority of that amount is going towards interest. Or that the first years of any type of credit or loan, whether it's for a home or an unsecured loan, the first years of payments we are only paying interest, with 0 or very little going to capital. But some do not realize this because they do not have financial intelligence. And so we must learn and know how to manage credit and loans. What else does a budget reveal? A budget reveals what we consider to be important. Where do you spend your money? Well, on things that you consider important. And this is why I have to talk about the following point. The budgets of the majority of people reveal that we do not honor God. I do not know whether or not you believe in tithing or in offering, or perhaps you're in that group of people that say that it's a ripoff or the pastors steal that money, so I'd rather give my money to the poor. And in this way, you're evading this topic. But that's not how it works. Our budget reveals if we honor God with what we receive. If God blesses me, if God gives me provision, I should honor Him. And how do I honor God? I honor Him with the extension of His kingdom, because the money we contribute for the church is for the extension of His kingdom. Now, if we want to give an offering to those in need, to the poor, that's separate. That is philanthropy. But when we talk about honoring God, it means participating financially in what has to do with the extension of His kingdom, for His word to be preached. But many people say, Pastor, how can I have money for that if I do not have money even for my bare necessities to pay my bills? How can I have enough money for that or to tithe? But this is the reality, and we'll talk about this in tomorrow's challenge. And pay close attention how God makes things work. And so often in our budgets, it is revealed that we do not have financial intelligence. When we do not know how to manage credits, we do not have savings, or we do not know how to invest. And so to begin to wrap up, because we have a limited amount of time, pay close attention. Luke chapter 28, or Luke 14, verse 28. We talked about it yesterday, and we'll talk about it again today, where it says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? This talks about a budget, how to plan a week, bi-weekly, monthly, in order to do what we need to do, because there are those who are paid and the next day they're looking to borrow money for the week because they have nothing left over, because we spend more than what we earn. So we're constantly in debt with zero savings, nor do we have provision for unexpected expenses, which often come up. So we must have financial intelligence, good financial habits. Do not complain about money, because if you are not managing what God gives you well, do not expect to receive more. And I guarantee this, if you do not know how to manage what God is giving you, what God has given you up until today, do not expect more, because we must be faithful and intelligent and honor God with what we receive. Because good administration, good management is very important. And where does this begin? It begins with creating a budget. So take note, the basis of a budget, income and expenses. And so the base of a budget is income and expenses. Then write everything down. Point number 1, write everything down. And you can do it monthly. Write down all the money that comes in and all the money that goes out. This way you can have some type of control, because there are those who do not even know how much money comes in, perhaps because they receive money from different sources, multiple sources, and they do not know how much their income is, how much they're earning. And also there are those who do not know how much they spend, because they spend here and there, but they do not have control of what their expenses are. And so many say, well, I never have any money left over. But it is because we must have control. But at least during the first month, you must be meticulous. If you buy a cup of coffee, write down what that cup of coffee costs, what you spent for it. If you bought another cup of coffee 2 hours later, write it down, and you'll be surprised and perhaps say, why am I spending my money on this or that? So point number 1, write everything down. And although this may sound tedious, it is important you do it, in the sense that you must write everything down, everything that comes in and everything that goes out. In this way, you will be able to know what comes in and what goes out. Point number 2, and I'll always talk about this, we must have faith in our income, and we must have principles in our expenses. Explanation. Sometimes I hear, well, Pastor, I'm going to buy this because I have faith that money will come in. No, place faith in your income. In other words, Have faith that God will give you different sources of income so that you're able to make more money here or there, or so that business goes well. Have faith in that so that there are different ways, means that God will bless you. But when you go to spend your expenses, only spend what you have. You should never, ever spend a single dollar that you have not yet earned. Well, it's a bonus that I'm expecting, or it's money that's owed to me. It has not yet arrived. Do not spend what you have not yet received in your account. This is a priority in a budget. Third, every budget must be carried out. Because often the problem is we create a budget, but at the end of the month we did not follow it. No, companies would be broke if they did not carry out their budgets. For example, when a company has a budget, they have to meet that budget every month. And what does this execution of my budget mean? For example, if I had to pay $100 in rent, but then I spend $200, why did I spend $200? If it should have been $100, why is it more? Or if in my budget I have $50 for utilities, but my bills came in for $300. My utility bills came in for $300. What happened? Why did they go up? And so when we write these things down and when we execute our budget, we're able to see what's going on. We can see the behaviors of our income and the behaviors of our expenses. And so pay close attention to this, because we must execute our budget. If we do not, it is as if we did not have a budget. And so pay close attention to this. If we are able to execute our budget, then we can have a balance. If you receive income weekly, then carry out a weekly budget. Bi-weekly, then do a bi-weekly budget. Or monthly, carry out a bi-weekly budget. A monthly budget. And in the same way, balance your budget weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. So do you see, this is how you execute your budget. Second point, take into consideration your additional income. And so, for example, if you have additional income, you can say, well, now I can invest more. Fifth, consider expenses not in your budget. And this can become a headache. Never buy something if you have to ask yourself the following question. Do I have enough in my account? Do I have available credit on my credit card? You should never have to ask yourself this question. The question when you go to buy something is it in my budget? And so do you see, this changes everything. And the next point, just as you evaluate your additional income and the expenses that are not in your budget, you should also consider extra expenses, emergencies. And this is why we must have savings, because things happen. You have a car and you have a flat tire. So where's that money going to come from? You have a dental issue and dental emergency. Where are you going to get the money to pay for it? Your son, daughter had an emergency. Where's that money coming from? So if you do not save or have a plan for emergencies, then you will never have enough money. And this is why a budget is so important, because without it, we do not have direction, a compass. Which way is north? We do not live by discipline, nor do we have financial intelligence to know where we are headed. And we will continue talking about this tomorrow. And write the following there in the YouTube channel. Write to us. Is it easy or is it not easy to live by a budget? Answer that question. Is it easy or is it not easy to live by a budget? Make any comments you would like regarding a budget. Tell us what God has told you, spoken to you in regards to this topic of a budget. Remember that this 12th challenge tells us that no one knows what they have until they write it down. Pray with me. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the beginning of this new day. Thank you for your presence with us. Oh, my dear Lord, this financial topic is not easy. But today, more than ever, in the light of the two examples that we studied in your word in the Bible this morning, we must know that you work with what we have, that you will not bless us more if we are not faithful with what we have. Thank you for each listener of Mana, and I pray for the wisdom of heaven to fall upon this area of their lives, so that we may live a life that is organized and disciplined. We commend ourselves to you, and we ask for your blessing in Christ Jesus. And remember, although tomorrow is Saturday, we will continue, and also through Sunday, because our goal is to fulfill these 21 challenges. And of course, this month, our devotionals are longer, but this is what it takes to fulfill our challenges. And so, for example, Fridays are typically Fridays of prayer, but instead, for now, we're carrying out our challenges. During the weekends, we typically do not have devotionals, but we are carrying out devotionals with our challenges. All this to fulfill our task of these 21 challenges. And so let's continue, and I wait for you tomorrow with our 13th challenge. Blessings to all.